Well, welcome to another installment of the Fatman GM rants his butt off. I was looking at some of the material I was reading last night and rereading this morning before doing some blogs on, and I did one blog on the variousness of humans in the Middle Earth, and got me thinking on a couple other things. You know, is it me? Maybe it's just me. Let's look at the dwarves in this particular installment. In Dungeons and Dragons and in most Dungeons and Dragons style game systems, there's dwarves, and of all the fantasy races, traditionally speaking, the dwarves are the most. Next to the halflings, I guess the hobbits, the halflings fit into this category too. But the dwarves are more accepted by the human races than the elves are, for some reason. And the argument will be made that, well, no, most humans like elves because they're beautiful and they're smart and they live forever and on and on and on. And I think in part that's a fallacy. I think that the humans in general, especially the lesser advanced humans, culturally speaking, and civilized version, speaking, tend to relate to the dwarves far easier because the dwarves are less. They're more blunt. They're more down to earth, so to speak. They're less threatening in some aspects. They're not. They don't have that great beauty. They don't have that immortality that sets these elves apart from most humans. The humans, except a handful of elf friends, if you will, majority of the humans live in some bit of awe and fear of elves, where they don't so much from the dwarves. It's much easier to find a dwarf craftsman or a dwarf blacksmith in a human town being accepted as a member of the community than it is to find an elf fletcher or an elf innkeeper, which which is a rarity. How often do that would based on your individual GM style and world building. That's true, but the line bulk of the pre-bought material tend to have a unspoken set of standards for how these particular races are to be seen. We had a recent brief discussion on the Brigade channel about the blending, therefore, of these races, and that some game systems are doing away with these distinct character blocks or civilization blocks between the races, in part because of social justice warrior BS, I guess, or because of this wish to stand out and be different from the standard that's been churning stuff out for 50 years. And I guess it's okay. I'm not going to get into detailed opinions on the subject. I have a growing concern about the social justice warrior concept and some of what's going on in our society today that has no bearing on this particular plot. So in the Dwarven communities, in most Dungeons and Dragons, you have now they list in the monster manuals and stuff a number of variety of dwarves, but traditionally the dwarf is a dwarf. They don't have a lot of cultural distinctions, as opposed to the elves, where you have high elves and wood elves and middle elves and aquatic elves. Well, they have a huge variety. But the dwarves don't seem to have that. Well, the variety's there, but it's much more subtle, and more of it's got to do with clan and terrain based. The ones who, like the deep dwarves, who live much further underground, and then the hill dwarves, and then but you don't see a high dwarf now. In culture and stuff, they're much easier to find these guys living in human settlements than you would elves. And it's unheard of to find dwarves living in elvish settlements, and vice versa. Not impossible, just unheard of. It's just not in the regular canon of most game systems, if you will. Now, looking at Lord of the Rings, which I've been focusing a lot of my efforts on the last year anyway, last 7-8 months, J.R.R. Tolkien's take on dwarves, they actually come in several categories, although it's hard to define it unless you really look at it from a perspective of comparing it to the elves. okay, which I hate to do, and I'm sure the dwarves themselves would protest quite deeply me doing that. Durin's folk, the great house of Durin, the line of Durin, the most well known of the seven dwarven clans or houses, uh, would be the equivalent of the Elvish High Lords. These are the high dwarves. These are the most predominantly culturally distinctive, developed of the seven houses. These fellows are the dominant dwarven political power in Western Middle Earth for the bulk of its history. Now, that's not to say that they're all that in a bag of chips. The two dwarven houses that live in the Blue Mountains, or what's left of them, trace their lineage back actually much further back than Durin to some degree, because they were far more the dwarves of Belghost and Norgrad, or however it's pronounced. They were prominent players in the early conflicts between the elves and Morgoth back in the day, although there was some slight sidebar stuff going on there between them and the elves, which is why the dwarves and the elves don't get along too well in Middle Earth. Though their houses were pretty powerful, but then they took a big punch when the western half of Middle Earth broke off and was destroyed, and their huge citadels were rocked to the core. Half of them collapsed, and so on and so forth. Durin's people in Moria survived that and made them the permanent power of the Dwarven kingdoms. What we don't see is the Eastern Dwarves mentioned very much. And I know if you look at the numbers, 7 Dwarven clans, we know of 3, the other 4 therefore have to be in the East. And according to these source books, that's where they show up. Iron Crown made sure we covered a couple of them. One of them is in here in the Yellow Mountains, called the Mad Blood Dwarves, and they are, well, just as sophisticated and kept industrious as any Dwarven clan, but they don't quite rival the Durin's folk for sheer advancement and power. They just don't. And physically speaking, you look at the artwork the few bits of artwork that Iron Crown put in there. These guys look a little bit less. They look more rustic, more rougher around the edges than Durin's folk, and that might be by design. Now, in Lord of the Rings, we also have a third category in J.R.R. Tolkien's world. Lord of the Rings, in his world, we have a third group of third category dwarves, which are very rare, and they get mentioned in some of his secondary novels or his stories from pre-Lord of the Rings, called the petty dwarves, and these are more or less physically deformed outcasts of the dwarven culture who established their own culture, but over time it's slowly diminished because they just don't their capabilities of reproduction are very diminished. The average dwarf in any realm setting are not prodigious in the aspect. It sounds like the elves crank out more babies than the dwarves do. The dwarves, traditionally, their women are about a third of the population, so there's far fewer of them. They rarely see them outside of the dwarven citadels. As stories go, it takes upwards of 2 years for them to have a baby, and they don't have them very often. And if a dwarf couple marries, they marry for life, and if one of them dies, that's that. They don't remarry. So you might have a whole, especially in such a warlike, militant mindset as the dwarves, that could be a problem. So if you have a lot of dwarves who go out and fight battles and wars and spend a lot of time in very dangerous environments, such as deep mines and at the forges where possibility of death is still there. The fact that somebody dies and then the wife don't remarry, well, that's lost progeny. It's harder on the culture. I guess that's why you see in most of our gaming realms or gaming worlds, the dwarves are not a dominant culture, and they don't seem to be growing They don't seem to get bigger. They don't have huge dwarven kingdoms. These fairly large citadels. I think you see the most active, largest communities of dwarves I ever see is in Faerun, in Lord of the Realms, Lord of the Rings, or in Forgotten Realms. Now, that's not to say that Dragonlance doesn't have quite a few, but I guess because I read more Forgotten Realms than I did anything else. In Middle Earth, there's distinct cultural, and they're on the decline, just like the elves. The elves are on the decline. Elves in Middle Earth fought and died in the millions over the millennia. And when they came, first off, they were passing, a large contingent of them passed through and then out of Middle Earth to the Undying Lands, and then a good portion of them came back to fight Morgoth, and then were either wiped out, sent to the back to the Undying Lands, or eventually in smaller numbers and individually migrated back home. And what they didn't talk about was the large numbers of Avari elves, or dark elves or wood elves or what have you, that stayed behind. It didn't go west, and we see enclaves, Threndel's elves and Mirkwood is an example of that. The lion's share of the elves who live in Linden and in with Elrod and at Rivendell and in Lothlorien are Avari elves, wood elves, or common elves. These are not they're not quite wild elves, but there's contingents of them too, but they're not the high elves, and they they breed slowly like the rest of them. Eventually they get. The story goes that the time of men are come by the fourth age. Elves are on the way out. It doesn't discuss what's going to happen to all these enclaves of Avari elves, but I imagine, given time, the same thing that happened to the high elves is going to happen to them. They just don't pursue an aggressive world building campaign, so they don't breed like rabbits. Humans breed like rabbits. That's why we tend to dominate every environment we come into, because we keep trying to crank out the progeny. It is what it is. So we see the dwarves, and we see the distinct classes within the dwarves. Mostly it's got to do with politics and clan membership, and not about racial differences. We don't see a whole lot of racial differences in dwarves. The irony is not lost on me that a typical dwarf can be found anywhere in Faerun, and he's still a typical dwarf. Right? In Middle Earth, the average dwarf is the average dwarf, and whether he's in the west, hanging around the Lonely Mountain or Moria, or he's in the Far East, he's still the typical dwarf. There's very little distinctive culture difference. You don't see the variety there, and nobody wanted to mimic the human variety, so we have that already. But it is what it is. So, as of Lord of the Rings, like I said, we have three distinct types, and although the argument can be made that the so-called high dwarves and the regular dwarves are one and the same, and I would back that up to some degree. I think the only reason that sets the line of Durin apart from everybody else is that they were the number one of the 7 house clans, the oldest and the most established, and the one that had the most wealth, and that in part had to do with Moria and True Silver than it did anything else, and their location, and geographically speaking, for a long time, which is ironic because when you look at books like Shadow of the South, the Yellow Mountain Dwarves have a very rich economic environment to draw on, and yet they don't seem to do as successfully as their cousins at Moria did. So, let alone in the Lonely Mountain, we all know of the Lonely Mountain treasure hoard. So it is what it is. Something to consider. If you don't agree, if you agree, don't hesitate with something in the comment section. Log the comment. Tell your buddies. Tell your friends. Always welcome new subscribers. If you don't enjoy the stuff, then you don't, so be it. I'm still putting my 2 cents worth in my opinions. I'm Fatman GM, and this is my rant.